Hi and welcome to the first online lecture in the series for Earth Science. We are going to be going over Chapter 1, Introduction to Earth Science today. My name is Mr. Shade. Before we get started, there are a few things I wanted to give you some information on. If this is your first time logging on and this is the first video that you're watching, there is another video that you should watch first. The other video is going to be an instructor and class introduction. It'll have all the online tools, the various procedures, and pretty much everything that you need in order to be successful at this online learning format for my classroom. A few reminders before we get started. First up, there are going to be links at the bottom of each of these videos. Students are expected to watch all of the links included in the description of the video, and you should expect the materials covered here to be on the quizzes and assessments that you take in class and that you take outside of class as well. You can take quick notes on the videos on the spare notes section provided in your chapter notes. Those particular notes are either found in class, where I can give you a copy of those, but I'll also have a link of them down in the description below. And those notes go with the lessons that you guys are getting today. Feel free to pause the video at any time. You should be completing the notes as you go and not at the end of the video. That's very important. So let's get started. First up here, Introduction to Earth Science. We're on Chapter 1. There are 30 total chapters this year. The 30 total chapters go over 4 major branches of Earth Science, and we're going to start with a general overview of all of those today. So, starting off, what is Earth Science? Earth science is the name for all the sciences that seek to understand the Earth and its neighbors in space. Can you tell what the 4 branches of Earth science might be based on the images to the right? Well, over here we have a nebula, we have a volcano, we have an undersea vent, and we have a tornado. Each one of these 4 basically is an item or representation in the 4 major areas of Earth science. Those 4 areas are geology, oceanography, meteorology, and astronomy. At this point in time, you should take a look at your notes that you have printed out in front of you. You'll notice on the left-hand side, under number 1, it says 4 branches of Earth Science, A, B, C, and D. In those sections of the notes, you should be writing these 4 down in order: geology, oceanography, meteorology, and astronomy. You'll also notice that those particular portions of your notes also have other sections farther down. Typically, when we go through this, the lecture will go in the exact same order as the notes, and as you go with the notes, you fill them out. The notes will be expected to be filled out for points and other things in class. So let's jump into each one of these. The first one, geology. Geology itself focuses on the study of the history, physical structure, and natural phenomena that shape the Earth. It's broken into 2 major branches: historical geology and physical geology. Historical geology looks to understand the origins of the Earth and its development through history. Primarily, we use things like rock layers or other physical features to try and determine what the past was like. Usually, these can be very, very accurate, because when something is finally essentially etched in stone, it's there forever, unless it's eroded away. Physical geology is probably something you're a little bit more familiar with. It seeks to understand the processes that operate beneath and upon the surface of the Earth. Because this is a freshman level course, you guys are probably more familiar with things like volcanoes and earthquakes, maybe some erosion related stuff, the water cycle. All of those are going to be part of physical geology, and they're essentially going to be acting upon the Earth in real time in your own lifetime. Historical geology usually takes place outside of your lifetime, and because of that, studying it can be a little bit difficult. On your notes, you'll also notice it says geology, studying 2 things, and under each one it says example. Well, we know what the 2 things are: historical geology and physical geology. You should have written those down by now. But what about some examples of these? So, here are some different items that are commonly seen when we're studying earth science. We have rocks here. we have lava, and we have a time scale. So what kind of examples could we pull from this? Well, for historical geology, we could say the layers of the Earth is a good example of historical geology, because the different layers have all sorts of different types of fossils inside them. You could say fossils as well. You could say ancient life. Anything like that would work. But what about physical geology? What would be an example of that? Well, perhaps physical geology would be an example of something like a rock that's already formed, or something like the chemistry of a rock, or maybe lava going onto the surface of the Earth, or an earthquake happening, or a volcano going off. We could use any of those as an example for a physical interaction of the Earth. And in fact, when we get into our full lectures for all of these, each one will basically have its own chapter, and we'll have a whole lot of dedicated material in order to figuring it out. Let's go on to the next one. Oceanography. Oceanography is the study of the oceans, including seafloor topography. That's the bottom of the ocean, the actual shape of the seafloor itself. Water chemistry, like how much salt or oxygen is dissolved in the water. Water currents, like where the water goes from place to place. And then marine life, like whales, dolphins, fish, all sorts of different animals that are there. Oceans themselves cover about 70% of the Earth's surface, and it's why we get the nickname for Blue Planet. Because it covers such a tremendous portion of the surface of the Earth, it also has this tendency to interact with a lot of the other areas. So for example, geology, one of the major components is erosion. Erosion is driven by water, usually, and most water for erosion comes from the oceans. Another example would be our atmosphere. Our atmosphere moves around a lot. It absorbs lots of energy. It also has a lot of things that are evaporated in it, like ocean vapor. And that vapor itself goes up and makes storms. And so oceans and geology and the atmosphere can all interact with each other, and there can be a lot of crossover when trying to study each one of these. Now your thing asks for 4 different things that oceanography studies. That's these 4: seafloor topography, water chemistry, water currents, and marine life. And then it asks for an example of each. So let's talk about those examples. First one, seafloor topography. We could put something like underwater mountains or underwater canyons as a good example for that. For the water chemistry, we could put something as simple as salt water or dissolved water in the, or dissolved oxygen in the water. For the next one, the ocean currents, we could name an actual ocean current. So for example, you could name the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the one that flows around Antarctica. Or you could name the Gulf Stream Current, the one that comes up here and wraps around the Gulf of Mexico. Most of these guys are named for the locations that they happen to be in. The last one, marine life. You could literally name any marine life thing that you could think of, or you could name some of the behaviors and structures that we see. So for example, like this, a school of fish. Why do you think that fish like these tend to bundle up? What could be the possible advantage of that? We'll talk about that when we get into that particular chapter. Next up, meteorology. Meteorology focuses on 3 primary things: the atmosphere, weather, and climate. And typically these 3 things just kind of have a little bit of difference between them. The atmosphere itself denotes pretty much everything that the Earth is able to hold on to with its gravity. That's a gas. Weather denotes all of the different changes that happen when heat and energy are moving around in the atmosphere. And climate denotes weather essentially over time, but it also denotes things like general temperature in an area over time, as well as other big factors like the temperature at the equator being different from the temperature at the poles. That's a part of climate as well. All atmospheric activity is produced by the Earth's motions itself and solar energy. A lot of people don't think this or don't realize it, but the spinning of the Earth itself actually has a lot to do with how the atmosphere works. Another thing to note here is that the atmosphere only accounts for an extremely thin layer around the outside of the Earth itself. And if we compare the Earth and its atmosphere to the apple and its skin, the skin of an apple is about 20 times thicker relative to the size of that apple than the size of the atmosphere is to the Earth. So the atmosphere is really, really thin. Because that atmosphere is so thin, it can absorb and release a tremendous amount of energy in very short periods of time. The Earth and the oceans, by comparison, are much, much larger and can hold much greater amounts of energy, which means that events like volcanoes and tsunamis are a lot rarer than atmospheric storms like a hurricane or a lightning storm. Let's move on. What do you think some of these are? You can probably spot a couple of them. Like up here, you could probably guess that this is a hurricane. This here is lightning. But what about this guy up here? In fact, because the atmosphere is filled with gases and essentially moves around so much, the sheer number of different events that can occur in the atmosphere are on a much different scale than the events that can occur in the ocean or the events that can occur in our crust or our mantle in the surface of the Earth. Because of this, studying the atmosphere generally is a pretty difficult thing. It's like trying to study a cup of liquid that somebody is stirring while they're stirring in it, and you're inside of the cup. So it's not very easy. The last branch of Earth science is astronomy. And this one's really, really simple on your notes. It just says, astronomy, study of the universe. Astronomy is one of the oldest branches of Earth science. And modern astronomers use Earth-based and space-based telescopes and other instruments to study the sun, the moon, the planets, and the universe itself. Because astronomy is such a very old and complex branch of Earth science, with the age of the universe being 3 times older than the age of our own planet, it can be a little bit difficult for some people to wrap their head around. So we dedicated an entire set of chapters to this right at the end of this year. Also, because of the distances, the masses, and the amounts of energy are magnitudes larger than anything that we can recreate here on Earth, it's much more difficult and expensive to study than any of the other 3 branches. Some aspects of astronomy we can't even get close to studying unless we literally shoot a rocket up into space. That makes it pretty difficult for the average person here on Earth to be able to study it. What are some of the things that we might look at when we get to those chapters? Well, things like this. Maybe you can guess what some of these are. Most people, when they first see this top one, they think, oh, that must be a star. It's actually just a comet. It's much, much smaller. There is a star on this picture, and it's this bottom one down here. This particular star is actually in the process of dying. That's why it looks like it's shooting off large amounts of material. The last one on this list is a galaxy. Excuse me. So, with that said, those are the 4 main branches of Earth science. You should notice that the left-hand side of your notes on the front page are almost filled up. And in fact, you will be moving on to the back side. In this first chapter, we not only combine together what the major areas of Earth science are, but also how we study science in general. And for this, we like to keep things a little bit simple. Nice little sets of rules that help us to kind of figure things out. But first off, how do we study science? What are some of the terms behind it? The first one that you guys are going to be very, very familiar with this entire semester is a term called inquiry. Inquiry is basically the process where we ask questions. Here it says, phenomena is the name we give to anything in nature that we don't understand. So when something happens, whether or not it's an animal in nature and they have a certain behavior, we could call that a phenomenon. When 2 atoms combine and we don't know why, we could call that a phenomenon. When a volcano goes off and we weren't sure why it happened in the first place, or there were no signs of it going off, that could be a phenomenon. Or when a star blows up in space and we have no idea why, that could be a phenomenon. The goal of science in general is to study and explain natural phenomena. It can happen on small scales, on the scale of atoms, in which case it's basically biology. Or no, that's chemistry. It could happen phenomena with life, which is biology. Phenomena with mathematics is just mathematics and physics. And in general, whenever we're trying to study what those phenomena are and trying to figure out what they're called, we call it inquiry. We're just trying to answer questions. Scientists ask questions about natural events and then work to answer those questions through experiments and examination. But while we're trying to examine those major events, we also need to make sure that the processes that we take are going to be accurate and very, very, very reliable. Typically, as humans, we kind of have a tendency of just assigning blame or assigning value to certain things that don't necessarily have those. It's how our brain works. We like patterns. And so it's natural for us to assign patterns to things that maybe they don't have a pattern. Science is meant to try and essentially only assign patterns to things that actually do have patterns, and to get rid of the patterns in other things that don't actually have them, even if they seem like they do. So what are some of our rules for inquiry? What are some of the things that we really need to kind of focus on when we're doing it, and the things that scientists in general do in order to make sure that their inquiry works relatively well? Well, there's 3 basic rules that I want you guys to be familiar with. First off, scientists start with the assumption that nature is understandable. Whenever we come across something that we don't understand, we don't just throw up our hands and say, well, that's that, and we don't get it. We approach it from the idea that whatever happened, we should be able to figure out why. There is no divinity in it. There's not really any supernatural in it. When something happens, we don't say it's up to fate. We say, well, it must have happened for a reason, and we can trace those reasons back, one piece at a time. Our second rule here: scientists expect that similar forces in a similar situation will cause similar results, also known as nature is repeatable. So you guys have seen a pattern here, and hopefully when you're writing down your rules, you're not writing down all of this, you're just writing down the diluted version of it. So the first one was, nature is understandable. That should be the first thing you wrote down. Second one, nature is repeatable. Nature being repeatable basically means that when something happens in a certain pattern of events, we should be able to either repeat it ourselves, or when those events happen again in nature, we should be able to predict what happens. If we have a set of events in nature and we predict what happens and it does not come out what we predicted, it tells us that most likely our science was bad and that we need to rethink how we did things, and most likely what we think or what we understand is actually incorrect. This happens a lot in science, where a person thinks that something is happening, but in reality, it doesn't happen that way. And then when they try to repeat the experiment and it doesn't work, that basically tells them that the science that they used wasn't accurate, and they need to relook at it and rethink about it. The last rule on here: scientists also expect that nature is predictable, which means that future behavior of natural forces can be anticipated. Not only do we say that it's just predictable for future events, we also mean that past events and things like that can essentially help us out in predicting future things. So things that we may not have been around for. Let's say, for example, we see in the rock record a whole lot of evidence of plate tectonics, meaning plates moving around on the surface of the Earth. Because we see that in the past, we can predictably assume that it's going to happen in the future. Or let's say, for example, we see a whole bunch of evidence that Yellowstone has erupted in the past, and it's erupted multiple times. Nature is predictable. That might give us an indication that it is going to erupt again in the future. All right. Now you should have the left-hand side of your notes completely finished on the front of that page. Make sure to flip over to the back side. That second side has just a few other things that we want to look at really quickly. We only have 3 slides left. but don't zone out on me here. These last 3 slides here. First one, limits of inquiry into earth science. Earth science is a little bit unique in the fact that its limits on how we can do it are a little bit different than the other branches of science. So, for example, in chemistry, reactions can occur in a few seconds or in several years, in the longest case. In biology, a species might reproduce on a monthly, yearly, or decade or more interval, meaning that you could actually see an entire species essentially birth, live, and die their entire lifespan in your own lifespan. And even things like evolution can happen in just thousands or millions of years, and even some cases, evolution can happen in a single person's lifespan. There's actually some really cool evidence on this, specifically with foxes in Russia, where they essentially bred the foxes over the last 70 or so years to become very, very domesticated. And it didn't take them longer than the lifespan of the person who started it. But earth science is different. Earth science, for most practical cases, almost all of the events are measured in the millions of years and even into the billions of years. Let's give an example of something that has a really short lifespan in general, but you may never actually see in your lifetime. A volcano, a really big one. Volcanoes go off all the time. We get about 50 small volcanic eruptions here on the surface of the Earth per year. But the big ones, like Tambora, or Krakatoa, or Mount St. Helens, those ones may only go off once every 100 years or 1,000 years, meaning that if you do get the chance to experience one of those in your own lifetime, chances are your kids won't. And the next generation of scientists won't get to experience the same thing that you did. This makes it pretty difficult in order to study these things. So oftentimes when we're dealing with that, we have to approach it from a little bit of a different aspect. And another kind of big consequence of that is that science in earth sciences progresses pretty slow in general. Things that are a hypothesis today or a theory today in earth science will probably be a theory tomorrow. They'll probably be a theory for the next 100,000 years, simply because viewing them is going to take a really long time. So let's talk about that a little bit first. Dinosaurs lived for almost 200 million years. That's a long time. Earth's estimated age, 4.6 billion years. And the universe itself estimated to be 14 billion years old. And because the timescales in earth science are so much larger than our own lifespan, it can be possible to study any of it and not progress beyond theory or hypothesis. So let's take an example. Right now, we have something called the theory of plate tectonics. Theory of plate tectonics explains how mountains form, how volcanoes form, how mid-ocean ridges form. It explains all of the major land features here on the surface of the Earth. And we've known about plate tectonics for almost 100 years now. But we still call it a theory of plate tectonics. Why? Well, because plate tectonics happens so slowly that the events like building mountains and forming volcanoes and things like that, we've never actually seen it happen. We think it happens. We have a very good idea that plate tectonics is responsible. We have tons of evidence pointing to it. But because we can't repeat the experiment ourselves, and we can't live long enough to watch the entire process, it's going to stay a theory for a very, very long period of time. Another potential problem is things like this one here. The universe is 14 billion years old. You've probably heard of something called the Big Bang Theory. It's the idea that the universe started from a single point 14 billion years ago and essentially blew outward from that point like a large explosion. We still call that theory. Why? Why has that, even after decades of us knowing it, and we're still pretty sure that that's the effectively definitive answer to how the universe started, why do we still call it a theory? It basically falls down to the fact that we can't go back and watch it, and it's not something that we can effectively recreate. Because we can't do either of those two things, it's effectively going to stay a theory forever. All right, that's a little bit deep, but we have just one or two more things to kind of figure out and try to figure out some kind of sciencey stuff. So let's jump into it real quick, these last two slides. How do we actually do inquiry, and what are the processes for inquiry? You've probably heard of this before. The process for inquiry is known as scientific method. The scientific method is just a process. It's not really like an idea or a central theory or big thing like that. It's just the way that we answer a question, and it's how we do it in a fashion that has gotten us the most accurate answers possible. Scientific theory started in and around 200, 300, 400 years ago, and we still haven't really found a better process for how to ask a question and get a good answer. And why is this scientific theory so good? Well, it consists of a couple of different parts and some different checks and balances that allow us to see and view just how accurate our question was. So it usually consists of 7 parts here. Ask a question, then do background research. So go on Wikipedia and things like that today. But in the past, you might actually have looked at like, hey, what did this other scientist do? Did he do an experiment like me? Did he come up with the answer on his own? We construct a hypothesis, which is a guess of what we think will happen. Why is a hypothesis important? It helps us to identify more than anything else part of what our goal is, and it also helps us to give a very, very, very definitive answer at the end of this whole process. Because at the end, we're either going to say our hypothesis was accurate or it wasn't. It's either a yes or a no. And that's one of the reasons why scientific method is so good. There's not a whole lot of why questions in it. At the end of the scientific method, we always just come out with the same set of answers, either yes or no. And that's it. After we have our hypothesis, we construct an experiment. The experiment has to have a whole bunch of different things inside of it in order for it to be valid. And we'll actually talk about those a lot more in class. We do have one more slide on it on some vocabulary stuff, and we'll kind of cover that in a little bit more depth later. Did the procedure in general work? If yes, then we continue onward. If no, boom, we test it again with a new experiment. If our experiment keeps on failing, we might actually skip this step and go to data, analyze and draw conclusions, because essentially at the end of every hypothesis, we either need to say, yes, it worked, or no, it didn't. And if our experiment just keeps failing over and over and over again, it might be an indication that our hypothesis is critically wrong. After we get done with our experiment, we analyze our data. We look to see whether or not our data supports our conclusion, or supports our hypothesis, actually. If the results do align with our hypothesis, we essentially form a conclusion, and we communicate our results to other scientists or to the world itself. We write up papers and things like that. If it only partially aligns, or it doesn't align at all with the hypothesis, in real life, we might actually still communicate those results. It can be valuable just telling somebody that, hey, this doesn't work, just as much as it is communicating to another person that it does work. And oftentimes in science, what will actually happen is we'll go through another process where essentially the same scientist or a different scientist tries to make a new hypothesis, tries to form a new question, tries to make a new experiment, and goes through the whole steps all over again. The repetitiveness, or how many times this repeats over and over and over again, is a really, really, really strong indicator showing essentially how good of an answer did we get at the end. And when we're actually looking at this, just to give you guys an idea, generally in science, almost every time we go through this process, the most common answer is, it didn't work. We made a hypothesis, and it didn't work. And that's because the nature of how science works. There's far more wrong answers than there are right ones, and getting a right answer can be very difficult. The last thing you need, and you guys are going to be putting this on the bottom part of your Notes under number 8. There are 4 big definitions I want you to know because we will be going over these in class. Important terms for experimentation. 4 major terms here. Experimental group, control group, independent variable, dependent variable. These don't mean a lot to you guys right now, but you do need to write these down because our labs and our experiments will use these a lot. These are 4 main terms that help us to understand a little bit more about what a good experiment is and how it works. So let's start off here. An experimental group is the group of trials that will have something done to them. Essentially, they are the group being experimented on. The control group, or a backup group, that does not have anything done to them. We compare these 2 groups. So a control group might be if we have 2 plants and we're wondering how good Gatorade works on watering one of them. We water one with Gatorade and the other one we make a control group, meaning that we just do normal things to it, meaning we either give it just normal water or we just give it normal water, and that's it. Independent variable, dependent variable, both of these basically are 2 different variables that happen before and after the experiment itself. The independent variable is something that we change before the experiment, so essentially changing what we would feed a plant if that was our experiment. We're feeding one Gatorade and one water. The Gatorade and the water would be the independent variables essentially. And then the dependent variable would be the things that we measure afterwards. So what kind of things would you want to measure if you fed a plant Gatorade? Well, you might measure the size of the leaves. You might measure how droopy the leaves are, or the color of the leaves. Those would be dependent variables. Usually, a good experiment only has a few independent variables, or even just one at all, and a whole lot of dependent variables, so we can measure as many things as possible. That's it for the end of the video. Don't forget, at the end of this, please watch the video links in the description and finish up your notes for class. Have a great day.